Okay, this is going to be a quick technical dive into the heart of Nipendo and how we do things. So we've got the buyer side and supplier side, if we've established already. The basic ways that we move messages from one side to the other goes through a simple set of processes that are symmetrical on both sides. So take, for example, something that we might get through an ERP plugin, through a gateway from the ERP system, like an order, for example. It's in the original signal that came from that ERP system in a sender format that they've established there, and that are different from one customer to the next, even with the same sort of back-end system like SAP. From there, what we do is we adapt that, we put it through an adapter that puts it into a digital business document in a universal format, so that no matter what kind of sender format's coming, we first format it into a universal format using adapters that we've developed. And then secondly, we do processing on it using the actual digital BizDoc. Now we do some conversions on it. We do some other kind of translations of information. We apply some rules that are necessary and so on. So we do that in the central processing area. It's a very patented pending informational area there. And we'll get into the more depth about how that goes. But basically, we basically understand the document that came out in its original form in a more universal way. Then we convert it back into what would be a compliant BizDoc. That is, that all the rules have been applied and now it's in a universal format, but now coming out of our processing system, it's ready to be translated in the final gateway step into a signal that's what we call enhanced, because it's not the original signal. It's actually been added to based on our processing, and the receiver gets it in the format that they have, and then ideally, if the receiver has integration, it goes into their system in the format that their system understands with all the relevant information from that. So the order then goes all the way through that process, and perhaps some things that are necessary that are added as rules by the supplier are added in the processing step and come through in an enhanced document. The supplier may then turn around and do an acknowledgement, for example, and that becomes an original sender signal on their side, which goes through the same sort of changing into a universal format. Processing happens on it so that rules are applied, so that, for example, if the rule from the buyer side is that an acknowledgement should be line by line and not a full order acknowledgement, but a line by line order acknowledgement, that rule could be applied here. And if it's non-compliant with that rule, then we take a hard left turn back into the supplier system so that they can rectify that. So this could be a loop here, but processing it through, if it's compliant, then we change it back into an enhanced signal in the receiver's format, in this case the buyer receiving it through that thing. So this is a nice happy path of both ways. It's not always happy. Sometimes there are emails as interfaces on both the buyer side and the supplier side. And even if they need it, there might be an interface that is a user interface for suppliers getting in through the web or through mobile. They might actually take action on it there instead of going and doing it in their own system. If they don't have B2B integration, they would do it there and then push things back. So the loop would come in, take a left, and go through user interface to them, then they would take some action on it and respond that way. Similarly, we do have a user interface based on lots of different things out in the buyer world, some including the e-procurement like an Ariba or Coupa or an Evalua, but also we have our own portal for buyers to be able to interact with stuff too, so that they can have a loop that way as well. So these are all possibilities in the system. So if we dig down into the tech details, though, this is where we kind of get into the information. You look at the ERP plugins that are off the gateways, and those are basically different messaging standards, ready ERP interfaces, and a bunch of different communication standards that we have here. And so this is back-end documentation that you can have for that. The adapters, well, what do we do when it comes to the adapters? We're basically describing the message data that we see on the input into a basic universal message dictionary, and normalizing content and validating the messages with mandatory fields and so on. That's what adapters do. Then it gets to the processors, and this is where it gets very interesting. Processors actually are doing things around sequencing, making sure there's prerequisite conditions, that there's a process around those, and a workflow. There might be some document back and forth and multiple cycles there, and basically processing the document for understanding it at its deep level. And what we mean by that is kind of basically the different levels that our bots get involved are around this concept of communication, around context, comprehension, and compliance. If you think about how you communicate with a known context, like, for example, what are we talking about? What domain are we talking about? Are we talking about POs or invoices or whatever? It also has to do with who am I talking to? Who's saying this? Then there's translation, basically things like, this is an inquiry, so it requires a response, or this is a PDF and we turn it into an API. There's also, if it's not totally comprehended, then there's a kind of a resolution workflow that might need to go with that. And then there's rules that could be applied. So governance level rules and rules around if then, and kind of a tree of rules that we can apply to different things based on the sender and the receiver and what their expectations are. So this is a very brief look into the patented part of our processing engine, and so on. So the adapters on the back end side, remember going into where the target is looking at the business process firewall with a rules-based engine, rejection and holds kind of stages, the ability for reusable methods and custom methods based on who is getting this. So there's more detail around that here. And then finally, through the gateway to the other side, and a note about gateways, we talked about the integrations that are possible, but there's also how things are being transported, using which protocols are being transported. So here's a slide on a whole bunch of different kinds of transport mechanisms that we can use. So underpinning all of this, obviously, you have to care about security, performance, and architecture. For security, we've got the different kinds of security protocols that we have as a policy, and then an overview of the security in terms of encryption and decryption of data in transit and at rest. For performance, obviously, you have to care about performance, especially on the B2B side when machines are pumping out tons of data and handling data and so on. So we've got some performance characteristics here that we like to highlight. And then finally, the overall architecture and a little bit more of a technical architecture. You can kind of see the gateways and adapters and all the different business process engines and different things in terms of transforming the data and then transforming it back out. This is kind of the back and forth that you see here in a symmetrical framework.